Hello and welcome to Palo Alto Battlefield National Historical Park. You are at the site of the first battle of the U.S.-Mexican War, the Battle of Palo Alto. You're also at the only NPS site that interprets the U.S.-Mexican War. Now inside our visitor center over here, we have plenty of interactive exhibits and a 15-minute video that talks all about the battle and a little bit of the war. You excited to come on in? No, I'm excited. Let's get to it.
Hello, my name is Ruben. Thank you for joining us today. In the spring of 1846, all eyes turned towards events on the Rio Grande. When President James K. Polk addressed Congress in December of 1845, he stated, "The jurisdiction of the United States has passed the Capes of Florida and peacefully extended to Del Norte." With that statement, President Polk declared the boundary between Texas and Mexico was the Rio Bravo del Norte, also known as the Rio Grande. On December 29, 1845, Polk welcomed the former Republic of Texas into the Union, but the Mexican government asserted Texas was rightfully still a part of their country. Although Texas claimed independence from Mexico in 1836, Mexican leaders never recognized Texas' independence.
Questions about the boundary of Texas further complicated matters. When Texas claimed independence from Mexico in 1836, it declared the Rio Grande as their boundary. Mexico viewed Texas as a much smaller region, bordered in part by the Nueces River. The differing views on the boundary left in dispute a huge stretch of land between the two rivers.
To make his position clear, President Polk sent an army led by Zachary Taylor to Texas in July 1845. The seasoned general later advanced to the Rio Grande in March 1846. Taylor led his troops to the river's edge, setting up camp across from the city of Matamoros. His Mexican counterpart, General Mariano Arista, commander of the Army of the North, arrived in Matamoros at the end of April 1846. Arista was determined to drive out the U.S. Army as soon as possible. On May 8, 1846, General Taylor and roughly 2,300 U.S. troops faced off against General Arista and approximately 3,500 Mexican soldados.
Let's head out and take a look at the battlefield.
You are standing on the western edge of Palo Alto battlefield. At this point, you would have had to have ducked for cover as the cannonballs were whizzing by overhead. Behind me, we have the historic road from Point Isabel to Matamoros, with the Mexican battle line to the south and the U.S. battle line to the north. It would have been typical for the 19th century type of warfare, with the artillery and the infantry having smooth war weapons. The artillery cannons would have had a range of 600 to 700 yards, and the infantry would have had a range of about 80 to 100 yards. There would only have been 2 offensive maneuvers from the infantry on this battlefield, so there would have been little involvement on their part. In fact, at one point, the U.S. infantry was told to either sit or lay down as the cannonballs bounced by overhead. Let's take a look at the Mexican battle line.
This long row of flags represented where the 3,500 Mexican troops lined up from east to west in a mile-long line. And right here is where they took deadly cannon fire. 18-pound shells bursting overhead. 6-pound solid shot tearing through the lines. Now right here on this historic road, the Mexicans put their left flank, attempting to make a roadblock to stop Taylor and his troops from reaching the fort on the Rio Grande. Arista wanted Taylor's infantry to advance. Unfortunately, it did not. Instead, Taylor rolled his cannon forward and attacked those deadly balls. It was a 5-hour cannon duel that Arista and the Mexican troops were not equipped to fight. Let's find out why.
Over here, we have a replica of a 4-pound cannon that the Mexican forces used out here. Besides using these, they also used the 8-pound cannon. Now, this 4-pound cannon is very heavy for its size. It's very tough to maneuver on the battlefield. This model is a model that was designed 80 years before the battle even broke out. On top of that, this model doesn't really produce that much firepower, so when compared to the US 6-pound cannon, it was at a severe disadvantage.
This is a Mexican 8-pound field gun. Cannons like this one are nestled amongst the infantry ranks of the Mexican army here at the Battle of Palo Alto. These cannons were pretty heavy and huge, that they were mostly going to be static pieces on the field. So they were going to be placed in locations that were thought to have the best advantage because they weren't going to go anywhere after they started the battle. It was going to take too much effort on their part, the Mexican army, to maneuver them and then have to maneuver them again. So compare that to the US's light artillery that was more mobile. These cannons didn't compare. They were made around the mid to late 1700s. So a pretty old design, even in terms of the battle in 1846. Couple that together with the bad black powder of the Mexican army, these cannons didn't have the charge to send the cannonball on the other side of the field and hit their mark. They either go short or wide of their target and never quite making its proper destination. So in conclusion, these cannons pretty heavy. They've got bad black powder. You pretty much had a tough day ahead of you if you're a Mexican artilleryman.
Here, next to this row of flags, we are standing right next to the U.S. battle line. When General Taylor came down with his 2,500 troops, they emerged from this dense brush on the northern end of the field, and they were met with an impressive sight. Lined up in front of them, blocking the road, were the Mexican troops with General Arista forming a roadblock, all ready for battle. Taylor said that the bayonet was the thing, charge with the bayonet, but he soon changed his mind. Seeing that Mexican line stretched out in front of him, he wanted to avoid heavy casualties. He held his infantry back and rolled his cannon forward. It was easier because of the latest cannon technology, flying artillery. Flying artillery was a new, lightweight, easily moved cannon that could move swiftly, flying across the battlefield. Let's take a closer look at the U.S. artillery.
Directly behind me is a replica of the U.S. 6-pound cannon, also known as the flying artillery. Now, the flying artillery were lightweight cannons. Their mobility gave a huge advantage to the U.S. forces. Now, the flying artillery was actually a concept developed by Major Samuel Ringgold. This concept had the cannons attached to 6 horses, and they were able to maneuver around the battlefield in a matter of minutes. Now, compared to the larger, heavier Mexican cannons that couldn't be pulled by horses, and the Mexican army was at a huge disadvantage. Now, Major Samuel Ringgold, he actually came up with the idea after going across seas over to Europe and seeing how they developed their artillery tactics. Now, unfortunately, Major Ringgold was actually struck by a cannonball during this battle, so he only got to see the flying artillery once because after this battle he would die due to his injuries. However, it's safe to say without Major Samuel Ringgold and the flying artillery, the war between U.S. and Mexico would have turned out a lot different.
In addition to the U.S. 6-pounder light artillery, Zachary Taylor used larger cannons like the one behind me, the U.S. 18-pounder, to strengthen his defenses. This cannon was pulled by teams of oxen, and the cannon tube alone was made out of cast iron and got up to about 5,000 pounds itself. Not to mention the carriage that also goes along with it. So that limited them to mainly being on the old historic road. And because of that immense size, they got to stay as static pieces throughout the entire battle. With that, that also allowed them to fire these explosive volleys of shots over at the Mexican battle line and rain down chaos on the Mexican army.
At the conclusion of the battle, Mexican troops ended up delaying U.S. forces. However, the U.S. had a clear advantage with its artillery. The constant artillery barrage by the U.S. on the Mexican forces inflicted heavy Mexican casualties. At the end of the battle, 102 Mexican soldiers were killed, 129 of them were wounded, and 26 were missing. On the U.S. side, 9 soldiers were killed, 44 were wounded, and 2 were missing. The casualty numbers prompted General Arista to retreat after spending most of the night burying his dead soldiers. He ended up retreating to a site 5 miles down south of here that is known as Resaca de la Palma. The next day, the U.S. Army would head down to the exact same site where they would clash at the second battle of the U.S.-Mexican War, the Battle of Resaca de la Palma.
After the battles on the Rio Grande, soldiers thought the war would end quickly. However, Mexican leaders were willing to fight. They led the U.S. soldiers down through the mountains of northern Mexico, onto the beaches of Veracruz, and deep into the Valley of Mexico. Santa Anna returns to fight. Unfortunately for Mexico, he failed. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war. It resulted in Mexico selling its New Mexico and Upper California territories for $15 million. The United States now extended to the Pacific Ocean. In addition to that vast expanse of land, they gained ports, minerals, natural resources, and places that are now national parks. Mexico suffered national trauma. Political and military leaders struggled to revive the Mexican country and its people. Over the years, U.S. and Mexican relations have changed. There have been strong bonds between the two countries. However, there's still a struggle with distrust and misunderstandings from the war, its effects, and ongoing legacy.